Carmen Diaz stood behind her fishmonger's stall, her hands steady as she expertly gutted a fresh catch. The salty sea breeze blew across her face, and the sound of busy chatter and footsteps filled the air around her at Fisherman's Wharf. It was a typical day, the constant hum of life blending with the smell of the ocean and the tang of fish. But despite the familiarity of the scene, today was different. Something in the air felt heavier. She noticed him before he even said a word. Lucas Steele, the well-dressed man who had strolled through the market in his designer suit and polished shoes, looked out of place. He stopped at her stall, his gaze scanning the array of fish laid out in front of her. Carmen wiped her hands on her apron, feeling his eyes on her. "I didn't think they'd be so fresh," he said with a hint of condescension, as though it were a surprise to find such goods in the middle of a working-class market. Carmen looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Fresh indeed," she replied coolly, her voice calm but firm. "Just like the ones you'll find in the best restaurants in town." Lucas raised an eyebrow, a small smirk forming at the corner of his lips. He didn't seem impressed by her words. "I'm sure," he replied, but his tone carried the unmistakable air of someone who thought they knew better. "I just didn't think this place could afford such high quality." Carmen's grip on the fish tightened. She had dealt with condescending remarks like this before, but today, for some reason, it stung more. She had spent years building this small stall, battling against the assumption that people like her couldn't provide the best. "You'd be surprised what people like me can afford," Carmen said, her voice steady but edged with a challenge. She wasn't about to let him belittle her. Not today. For a moment, Lucas just stared at her, his gaze softening just slightly. It wasn't out of sympathy or respect, more like he was taken aback by her bluntness. But he quickly masked it, replacing the flicker of something he hadn't quite expected with the usual disinterest. "You must work hard," he said, almost as an afterthought, as if it were simply an observation, not a compliment. Carmen looked up, her eyes locking with his. "I don't work hard. I work smart," she replied, her tone firm. There was no room for pity here, not from him, not from anyone. Lucas didn't seem to know how to respond to that. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He glanced down at the fish, then back at Carmen. "I'll take 2 of the salmon," he said quickly, perhaps more to avoid further confrontation than out of actual interest in the fish. Carmen nodded, wrapping the fish in paper, her movements precise. She handed him the wrapped bundle, her eyes still on him. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice softening just a little. She was tired of the games, tired of the way people like him thought they could buy respect with a few polite words. He hesitated, clearly not expecting such directness. He seemed to want to say something else, perhaps to continue the conversation, but he only nodded once before turning to walk away. "You know, I've seen people like you around here before," Carmen called after him, her voice rising slightly, forcing him to pause. "They come in, look down on everything, and leave without ever seeing the worth in it. Maybe one day you'll realize there's more to this place than what you think." Lucas froze for a moment, the words hanging in the air. He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers. It wasn't a sneer anymore, but something else. Something almost human. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, a rare note of something like respect in his voice. And then, just as quickly as he'd arrived, he turned and walked away, the sound of his expensive shoes on the pavement fading into the background. Carmen watched him go, her chest tight. She wasn't sure why it had bothered her so much. Maybe it was the way he looked at her like she was beneath him. Or maybe it was the way he assumed he knew everything about the world she lived in. But for the first time, she wasn't ready to just let him go without leaving an impression. She shook her head, pushing the thought aside as she returned to her work. She had a stall to run, a life to live, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even someone like him, get under her skin. But something told her this wouldn't be the last time their worlds collided. The restaurant was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of high society chatter. Lucas Steele leaned back in his chair, casually surveying the crowd, his mind preoccupied with the upcoming project at his tech company. But it wasn't the latest startup he was thinking about at that moment. Elise Walker, a sharp and ambitious fashion entrepreneur, sat across from him, a glass of red wine in hand. She was the kind of person who saw the world in terms of opportunity and leverage, always calculating the next move. Their conversation had begun like any other: business deals, social events, and the latest gossip. But suddenly, Elise's voice cut through the air with a challenge that caught Lucas off guard. "I'll bet you $10,000, she said, leaning in slightly, her eyes narrowing with a playful but calculated gleam, "that you couldn't bring someone like her." She gestured subtly towards a woman at the next table, who wore a simple but elegant dress to a gala like the one I'm hosting this Saturday. "Someone from the real world, not the posh little circles you run in." Lucas raised an eyebrow, amused by the suggestion. He knew exactly where this was going. Elise was notorious for turning everything into a game. "You mean someone from the working class?" Lucas smirked, intrigued but not yet committed. Elise was playing into his ego, and he had to admit, he liked it. Exactly. A real down-to-earth person. Someone who doesn't belong in a room full of billionaires and fashion icons. "Think you can pull it off? If you do, I'll write you a check for $10,000, Elise said, her smile widening. "But I think you won't be able to do it. The real question is, will they fit in? Will they survive a night with people who are far beyond their world?" Lucas chuckled, sensing the bet was more about proving a point to Elise than any actual wager. But then the words settled in his mind and a thought sparked. "You're on," Lucas replied, his voice tinged with confidence. "I'll bring someone, but you'd better be ready to hand over that check, Elise." Elise's lips curled into a sly smile. "We'll see. You do realize I'm talking about someone who will absolutely not fit in, right? Someone completely out of place." Lucas, never one to back down from a challenge, leaned forward. "You underestimate me, Elise. I'll pick someone who'll leave an impression. You'll see. I don't need to prove anything to you. I'm just interested in how much I can shock you." "Good luck," Elise said with a wink, her voice dripping with amusement. "Let's see if your little experiment works out, Steele. But remember, I don't think anyone like that could survive in a place where people measure success by their bank accounts, not their stories." As the conversation shifted to other topics, Lucas's mind drifted. He wasn't worried. After all, he had never been afraid of a challenge. The idea of picking someone for this experiment intrigued him. It had to be someone who didn't belong, someone who wouldn't just blend in with the crowd. He didn't want to pick just any commoner. He wanted to make a statement. He wanted someone who would expose the pretentiousness of his world and shake things up in a way that no one could ignore. His thoughts immediately turned to Carmen Diaz, the fishmonger he had met earlier that day. She was sharp, unapologetically herself, and unwilling to conform. He could already imagine the looks of disdain she would receive from the other guests at the gala, and that amused him. This would be perfect. Not only would she make an impression, but she'd also prove Elise wrong. Lucas smiled to himself as he picked up his phone, ready to make the call. There was no turning back now. "I'll prove her wrong," he muttered under his breath, his fingers typing out a message to Carmen. Carmen stood behind her stall, the early morning sun casting a faint golden glow over the fresh catch laid before her. She'd been up for hours, slicing, prepping, and organizing. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was hers, hard-earned and honest. She moved with practiced precision, unbothered by the small crowd that had gathered to pick out the best fish for the day. But as she reached for a fillet of salmon, the sound of footsteps grew louder, followed by a voice she hadn't heard in hours, but would never forget. "Carmen." She froze, instinctively straightening up. She knew who it was even before she looked. Lucas Steele, standing at the edge of her stall, dressed in another one of his perfectly tailored suits. He didn't fit here. He never had, not in this world of simple street markets and saltwater air. Yet here he was, his sharp eyes trained on her with that familiar, dismissive smirk. She sighed, wiping her hands on her apron, trying to ignore the surge of irritation building in her chest. She had already dealt with enough condescension for one day. "What do you want, Steele?" He didn't flinch at her cold reception. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence almost oppressive. "I'm here on business," he said smoothly, "but not the kind you think." Carmen raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he was getting at. Business? She repeated. I'm pretty sure fish isn't your idea of a lucrative deal. Lucas chuckled, clearly unfazed by her sarcasm. Well, I was thinking more along the lines of an opportunity for you. Carmen crossed her arms, skeptical. And why would I be interested in whatever opportunity you've got? He paused for a beat, letting the words hang in the air between them. Then, as if deciding he'd played enough games, he dropped the bomb. I'd like to invite you to a gala, he said, his voice casual, as though it was just another event. But Carmen felt the weight of it, the absurdity of him extending such an offer to someone like her. Her eyes narrowed. A gala? She repeated, almost laughing. Is this some sort of joke? A working-class fishmonger at a fancy gala? You've got to be kidding me. Lucas's expression remained unreadable. It's not a joke, Carmen. It's an invitation. He glanced around at the bustling market, then back at her, his gaze softening slightly. I'm not offering you a seat at my table just because I think you'd fit in. I think you'll leave an impression. Carmen's lips parted in disbelief. An impression? You want me to be your token working-class guest at a fancy event? She shook her head, her voice growing more indignant. I'm not some novelty act steal. I'm not your charity case. Lucas held up his hands in defense. That's not what I meant, and you know it. I'm simply offering you a chance to see a world you've never experienced. I thought you might want to challenge yourself. It's your choice, of course. She looked at him, eyes hard. There it was again, the underlying assumption that she needed this, that it was somehow a favor he was granting. But something about his persistence intrigued her. It wasn't just the invitation, it was the way he said it. Like he wasn't sure if she'd accept, but he was willing to risk it. Carmen exhaled slowly. You're serious about this, aren't you? I am. His tone was steady, almost pleading. And I think you'll surprise them. You'll surprise yourself. She stared at him for a long moment, the weight of the decision sitting heavy in her chest. Everything in her screamed to reject him, to turn him down with the same cold indifference he had shown her. But there was a part of her, deep down, that wanted to take this risk, to prove that she didn't need anyone's permission to belong, to show him and the people at that gala that she wasn't just some commoner to be tossed aside. But it wasn't just about the challenge, it was about the principle. She wasn't going to let him think she'd come crawling, desperate for his world. No, she would walk in, head high, and take her place, whether they liked it or not. She met his gaze once more, the defiance in her eyes unmistakable. Fine, I'll go. But don't think for a second that I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this because I don't need anyone's approval. Lucas's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. I wouldn't have it any other way. She nodded sharply, then turned back to her work, her mind already racing. The gala was just days away, and the idea of stepping into a world that had never considered her existence felt both thrilling and terrifying. But if Lucas Steele thought she wouldn't leave an impression, he had another thing coming. Carmen stood in front of the full-length mirror, her hands on her hips as she studied her reflection. The dress, a deep emerald green that she had reluctantly chosen, clung to her frame in a way that felt foreign. She was used to worn-out jeans and an old jacket, not something designed for a night of elegance. The soft satin of the gown shimmered slightly in the light, making her feel like an imposter in a world she didn't belong to. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves. The invitation had been a spontaneous decision, one made out of defiance perhaps more than anything else. But now, with the gala only hours away, the weight of it felt much heavier. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but standing here in a dress that cost more than her entire wardrobe, she wasn't sure she felt like herself anymore. You're fine, Carmen, she muttered to herself, trying to convince her reflection. Just wear it like you mean it. Her fingers traced the hem of the dress. Tommy had offered to drive her to the event, but Carmen had turned him down. She didn't want his sympathy. She didn't want anyone to treat her like she was walking into a battlefield. No, tonight was about proving something. About proving that people like her didn't need to be transformed to fit in. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She paused, staring at herself for a moment longer before turning to answer it. As she opened the door, Lucas Steele stood on the other side, his presence unmistakable, but something in his eyes had shifted. He wasn't the same cocky businessman who had barged into her world that day at Fisherman's Wharf. There was an unfamiliar sincerity in his gaze. "You look different," he said softly, his eyes sweeping over her. Carmen felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wasn't sure whether it was a compliment or a judgment, but she couldn't help the defensive edge in her voice. "Good different or bad different?" Lucas gave a small smile, but it was tempered with something else. "Good different. You look like you belong here." She raised an eyebrow at his words. "You sure?" "I'm not sure this dress is enough to make me belong in your world, Lucas." His smile faltered just a little, his gaze softening. "I didn't mean it that way. I just meant that maybe I misjudged you." Carmen looked down at her dress, fidgeting with the fabric. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Steele. I'm just here to see how far you'll go to prove me wrong." Lucas's expression tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Fair enough, but I'm not trying to impress you either. I want to see how you handle it. I think you'll surprise them." Carmen's eyes flickered with doubt, but she held her ground. "I'm not here for your entertainment, Lucas. I'm not some challenge to be won." He held up his hands in mock surrender. "I never said you were. But you're right. This isn't a game. It's about you showing that you can stand your ground in a world that's not yours. And trust me, I'm not expecting you to change. I respect the fact that you're doing this on your own terms." Her heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, she felt something shift in the air between them. It wasn't just the tension from the bet, it was something more. "Well, you can save the speeches," Carmen said, trying to shake off the sudden vulnerability she felt. "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to prove that I don't need anyone's approval." Lucas nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on her, the weight of their conversation hanging in the space between them. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady. The night's still young. They stepped out together, the door closing behind them with a soft click, but Carmen's mind raced. She wasn't sure if Lucas was right about her belonging in this world, but one thing was for sure, she wasn't going to let anyone tell her otherwise. As the car drove off toward Nob Hill, Carmen stared out the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Tonight would be a test, not just of her strength, but of what she was willing to prove to herself. And no matter what happened, she was going to walk into that gala with her head held high. The gala was nothing like Carmen had imagined. When Lucas had first mentioned it, she had pictured something extravagant, but nothing prepared her for the overwhelming display of wealth that greeted her as they stepped into the ballroom. The chandeliers overhead glittered like 1,000 stars, casting a warm glow on the marble floors that stretched beneath her feet. The guests around her were impeccably dressed, their laughter and conversation a soft hum in the background. And yet, despite the beauty and elegance of it all, Carmen felt like an alien in this world, a world that didn't belong to her. Lucas, on the other hand, seemed at ease, his posture relaxed as he greeted people with practiced charm. He introduced her to a few acquaintances, his voice smooth as he made her seem like an equal. But Carmen couldn't shake the feeling that she was out of place. Every time she spoke, every gesture she made felt too loud, too rough compared to the polished, poised people surrounding her. She tried to smile, tried to engage in the small talk, but each word felt foreign on her tongue. The laughter that came from the other guests seemed distant, like a sound she could never quite reach. The more she tried to blend in, the more her discomfort grew. She knew they were looking at her, evaluating her every move, and the realization made her want to retreat into the shadows. Lucas noticed her unease and gave her a glance from across the room. His eyes softened slightly, but he quickly turned back to the group of people he was talking to, as though trying to shield her from the attention. Yet, the more he acted like she was just another guest, the more her sense of self began to crack. "I don't belong here," Carmen muttered under her breath, barely noticing the woman who approached her until she was standing right in front of her. The woman was tall and impeccably dressed in a sparkling gold gown, her sharp eyes sizing Carmen up like an object. "Well, I must say you're quite brave to show up at all," she said, her voice laced with a faint hint of mockery. I wouldn't have expected someone from, well, your background to be comfortable here. Carmen's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. I'm just here to enjoy the evening, she replied, her voice even. But inside, she was seething. It was one thing to be judged by someone who didn't know her. It was another to be dismissed so openly. The woman raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. I'm sure. I'm Anna, by the way, she said, her smile thin and barely genuine. I hope you're not too overwhelmed. I'm not, Carmen replied, her voice sharper than she intended. She wanted to add something more, something that would make this woman understand that Carmen wasn't some curiosity to be poked at. But before she could, Anna excused herself and disappeared into the crowd. Carmen let out a breath, feeling the sting of the encounter. This was exactly what she had feared, the sense of being something less, something that didn't fit. But she wasn't going to let it define her. Not here, not tonight. She scanned the room, her gaze falling on Lucas, who was laughing with a group of guests. She had always known this world was different, but now, as she stood in the middle of it, it felt like it was light years away from her reality. He was right. This wasn't her world, but she wasn't about to let anyone see that. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. If they wanted to look down on her, fine. She'd stand her ground, no matter how out of place she felt. She had lived her life being underestimated, but tonight, she wasn't going to let that stop her. A voice pulled her from her thoughts. You're doing well, considering, Lucas said, stepping up beside her, his eyes scanning the room briefly before landing back on her. I know it's a lot to take in. Carmen gave him a tight smile. I didn't come here to impress anyone, Steele. I'm just here to prove I can be a part of it. He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her response. Fair enough, he said, his voice softer. But remember, you're not just proving something to them. You're proving something to yourself, too. For the first time that night, Carmen felt a small spark of something other than discomfort. Maybe he wasn't just trying to win some bet after all. Maybe, just maybe, he saw something in her that even she didn't fully recognize yet. But as the conversation shifted and more guests approached, the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She wasn't going to change for them, but she couldn't shake the feeling that, for all her determination, she was still fighting a battle against a world that didn't want her there. The night was far from over. Carmen had never felt so out of place in her life. She stood near the edge of the ballroom trying to blend in, but her heart raced, as though everyone around her could sense her discomfort. She was acutely aware of the murmurs and glances cast her way, and no matter how much she tried to ignore them, they gnawed at her. Each laugh, each whispered conversation felt like a jab. She wasn't part of this world, and they made sure she knew it. Lucas had been right. She was proving something, but not in the way he might have imagined. She was fighting for her own dignity, for the right to exist in a space that wasn't meant for her. She wasn't here to fit in. She was here to make a point, to herself, more than anyone else. But as she took another step toward the crowd, her heel caught the edge of the rug, and in that instant, the glass of wine she had been holding tipped dangerously. Time seemed to slow as she watched the red liquid arc through the air, splashing across the crisp white dress of a woman standing too close. "Oh my God!" the woman gasped, stepping back in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. Carmen froze, the heat of embarrassment flooding her face. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room turn to her, their judgment heavy in the air. The woman, her expensive gown now stained with wine, stood motionless for a second before snapping into action. "Look what you've done!" she snapped, her voice sharp with disdain. "Do you not know how to carry a drink? You can't just walk around like that." Carmen opened her mouth to apologize, but her voice faltered. She felt the room closing in on her. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to offer a heartfelt apology, but the words felt hollow. The woman didn't even give her a chance to speak, brushing her off with an exaggerated sigh. "I can't believe this," the woman muttered, glaring at Carmen as she turned to one of her companions. "Do you see this? A mistake like this could ruin an entire evening." Carmen's chest tightened. Her instinct was to retreat, to find a quiet corner and disappear. But she couldn't. Not this time. She refused to let one mistake define her in this world. She had worked too hard to be here, to let some rich woman push her around. Before she could gather her thoughts, Lucas was by her side, his voice calm but with a hint of irritation. "It's okay," he said, addressing the woman. "It was an accident. Don't make it worse." The woman scoffed. "An accident? I don't think so. Look at what she's wearing. She clearly doesn't belong here." Carmen's blood boiled. She couldn't stand the way the woman spoke, like Carmen's presence was some sort of mistake that needed to be corrected. But before she could say anything, Lucas stepped in again, this time with more authority. "I said, it's fine," he repeated, his voice unwavering. The woman gave a huff, clearly frustrated, but she didn't say anything more. She turned away, leaving Carmen standing there, her heart pounding. The tension in the air was palpable, and she could feel everyone in the room silently watching. Lucas turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" Carmen nodded, though she was far from fine. The sting of the incident lingered, and the anger she felt bubbled just below the surface. She hated feeling so small in this world, like her every move was scrutinized, ready to be judged. But she forced herself to swallow it down. "I'm fine," she said, the words coming out more steady than she felt. "Thanks for stepping in." Lucas's eyes lingered on her for a moment, his gaze calculating, but he said nothing more. The moment was awkward, but Carmen wasn't going to let it defeat her. "I didn't come here to be anyone's entertainment," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Lucas didn't respond, but his gaze softened, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Then don't let it stop you," he said quietly. "You don't owe them anything." And with that, he turned back to the crowd, blending into the sea of high society once again. But Carmen stayed where she was for a moment, trying to steady her racing heart. She had survived one humiliation, but the night wasn't over. She wasn't sure if she could take many more moments like that. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not until she had made her point. Carmen stepped away from the crowd, feeling the weight of the evening settle on her shoulders. The hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses. It all felt too much now. She needed a moment. She found her way outside onto a small balcony that overlooked the city. The cool night air hit her like a rush of relief, and she leaned against the railing, staring out into the distance. The lights of the city spread before her like a sea of stars, so far removed from her reality. She couldn't stop thinking about the wine spill, the judgment, the subtle whispers, each moment stinging worse than the last. She had never felt so alien, so utterly out of place. "What are you doing out here?" The voice came from behind her, and she turned to find Lucas standing there, his face unreadable. He wasn't wearing the confident smile that he usually did. There was no mask this time, just the rawness of someone who, for once, seemed unsure of what to say. "I needed a break," she said quietly, not bothering to hide the fatigue in her voice. "I don't belong here, Lucas. You were right. I don't fit in with people like them." Lucas stepped closer, a frown forming on his face as he looked at her. "You're wrong," he said softly, his gaze serious. "You do belong. This isn't about fitting in. This is about being who you are, no matter where you are." Carmen shook her head, the frustration building inside her. "Who I am? The world I'm in doesn't care about who I am. All they see is a fishmonger in a fancy dress, someone they'll forget the moment they look away. This whole thing was a mistake. I was foolish to think I could stand in their world and be accepted." Lucas stepped forward, his presence pulling her attention back to him. His eyes softened, the judgment gone, replaced with something else, something almost like regret. "No, you weren't foolish. You are strong, Carmen. More than most people I know." She met his gaze, searching for any sign of sincerity. "And what about you, Lucas?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "What do you see when you look at me?" He was silent for a moment, his expression serious. Then, in a voice that barely above a whisper, he answered, "I see someone who's so much more than they think. I see someone who refuses to be anything less than themselves, even when the world tells them they don't belong. I see someone who fights, even when they're alone." Carmen's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time that evening, she let herself feel something other than frustration. She felt heard. She didn't know why, but in that moment, with Lucas standing before her, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this battle. Maybe he didn't see her as a token to be showcased or a challenge to be won. Maybe he truly saw her for who she was. But the vulnerability that moment brought was something Carmen wasn't sure she could handle. She pulled her eyes away from his and looked back out at the city. "I didn't come here for your approval," she said, her voice steady, though the emotions inside were anything but. "I came here to prove something to myself, that I could stand in a world that wasn't meant for me and still be who I am." Lucas moved closer, his voice quiet. "And you're doing it, more than you know. But you don't have to do it alone." Carmen didn't know what to say. For a brief moment, she wanted to reach out to him, to let herself trust in the sincerity of his words. But old habits, old fears pulled her back. She had learned long ago that relying on someone else only led to disappointment. "I'm not here for anyone else's approval, Lucas," she repeated, though this time it was quieter, softer. "I'm here for me." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just the quiet of two people who were beginning to understand each other, even if it wasn't all the way yet. "I get it," Lucas said finally, his voice low and sincere. "You're stronger than I thought, Carmen. You're more than what they think of you, more than what I thought of you." Carmen turned to him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something in his words, in the way he was looking at her, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she had something to prove to him too. But she wasn't ready to say it. Not yet. She wasn't sure what she was ready for. So she simply nodded, her gaze falling to the ground. "You don't need to be anyone else here," Lucas continued, his voice soft. "Just be you, and I'll be right here, whether you're ready to trust me or not." Carmen didn't reply. She didn't know how to, but she felt the weight of his words settle inside her, like a spark in the darkness. For the first time that night, she didn't feel quite so alone. Carmen had barely settled back into the rhythm of the evening when she felt the weight of a familiar gaze. She had been scanning the crowd, trying to blend in, when Elise Walker appeared in front of her, a glass of champagne in hand, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Carmen," Elise said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I must say, you're quite the surprise. I didn't think you'd last this long." Carmen straightened, forcing a smile of her own, though it felt like a mask. "I'm not here for your entertainment, Elise," she replied evenly, her voice steady despite the growing unease that gnawed at her stomach. Elise's eyes sparkled with a glint of amusement. "Oh, I know. But you have to admit, you're getting quite a lot of attention. And not all of it is good, I'm afraid." The words stung, but Carmen refused to show it. "People can talk all they want," she said, her eyes narrowing, "but I'm not here for their approval." "Of course," Elise said, the mockery in her voice barely concealed. "But you should know, some of the others, well, they're not so kind about your presence here. You're making quite an impression, but not the kind you might want." Carmen's pulse quickened as the implications of Elise's words sank in. She had felt the whispers, the subtle glances, but hearing them spoken so directly made her stomach twist in discomfort. "What do you mean?" Carmen asked, her voice tight. Elise leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, though not enough to hide the sharpness in her words. "I'm just saying, some of the more influential guests aren't too thrilled with the idea of someone like you mixing with them. They're talking about it, and some are suggesting you might be here for other reasons." Carmen's heart dropped. The weight of Elise's words felt like a punch to the gut. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly what Elise meant, that Carmen, the fishmonger, was nothing more than a curiosity, a token for Lucas to parade around. Her stomach churned with anger and humiliation, but she held her ground. "I'm not here to be anyone's pawn," Carmen said through gritted teeth, "and I don't need your advice, Elise." Elise's lips curved into a smile, but it was cold. "Of course, I wouldn't dream of advising you," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I just thought you'd want to know what's being said about you. After all, the world you're playing in isn't as forgiving as the one you came from." Carmen's thoughts raced as Elise's words echoed in her mind. She felt like she was suffocating under the weight of it all. Under the weight of their assumptions, their judgments, their whispers. She wanted to scream, to shout that she wasn't just a sideshow to be looked at and dismissed. She was more than that. But just as she opened her mouth to respond, Elise straightened, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Oh, and one more thing," she said with a cruel smile. "Lucas might not be as on your side as you think. You might want to keep that in mind." The words hit Carmen like a slap, and for a moment she was paralyzed. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Elise's figure blended back into the crowd, leaving Carmen standing there, her thoughts swirling in a storm of doubt and betrayal. Was Elise telling the truth? Could Lucas, someone she had started to trust, really be using her as a pawn in some twisted game? She searched the crowd for him, her eyes landing on Lucas standing across the room with a group of guests. His posture was relaxed, his smile genuine as he spoke with a couple of well-dressed women. But in the back of her mind, the words Elise had whispered kept repeating. "Lucas might not be as on your side as you think." A cold shiver ran down Carmen's spine. Had she been so naive? Had she been blind to the fact that maybe to him she was just a means to an end? Maybe the gala was just a bet, a joke at her expense. She had convinced herself that Lucas saw her as something more, but now doubts clouded her every thought. Her heart ached. She didn't want to believe it. She wanted to trust him, needed to trust him, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and she wasn't sure if it could ever be uprooted. Carmen turned away, trying to shake off the crushing feeling of betrayal that had settled in her chest. She wasn't here for Lucas. She wasn't here for Elise. She was here for herself. And no matter what they said, no matter what they thought, she would prove them wrong. Carmen couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her chest. Since the gala, everything had felt off, like she was walking a tightrope between trust and betrayal. Elise's words echoed in her mind. Lucas might not be on her side after all, but she pushed them away, telling herself she was just overreacting. Still, something about Lucas's behavior didn't sit right. He was distant, distracted, as if the warmth he had shown her earlier had been replaced by something cold and calculated. It wasn't the Lucas she had first met at the market. It wasn't the Lucas who had stepped in to defend her when the wine spilled. She had to know the truth. It was late when Carmen decided to take matters into her own hands. She wasn't a detective, but she had lived long enough to know when things didn't add up. Lucas's past, his family, had always been a mystery. He had never mentioned it much, but tonight she couldn't ignore the feeling that it was important. If she was going to trust him, truly trust him, she had to know more. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a message from Tommy, checking in, asking if she was all right. She read it quickly, then typed back, "I'm fine, just need some space for a bit." She wasn't lying. She did need space. Space to think, to understand why she felt so shaken by everything. After a few moments of hesitation, she decided she'd do some digging. Carmen's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she searched Lucas Steele's name. The first few links were predictable. His tech company, interviews, profiles. But there was something off in the last search result. It was an old news article dated 5 years ago. She clicked it. Lucas Steele's family business under investigation for corruption. The headline was blunt and cold. The article detailed a series of allegations against Lucas's father, a powerful businessman who had built his wealth through unethical practices. Carmen's heart raced as she read further. It was worse than she thought. The article went on to describe how Lucas's father had been accused of exploiting workers, bribing officials, and hiding profits through shady dealings. But there was something more unsettling in the final paragraphs. Lucas Steele has always distanced himself from his father's actions, but sources close to him suggest that his wealth may not be as clean as he claims. Carmen's stomach dropped. She had known Lucas's world was one of privilege, but this felt like a betrayal. The man who had invited her to the gala, who had seemed genuinely interested in her, was tied to a legacy of corruption. Had he lied to her all along? Was his act of kindness just another play to get what he wanted? Her hands trembled as she put the phone down. For the first time, she felt sick to her stomach. She had allowed herself to trust Lucas. to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something real between them. But now, everything felt like a lie. How could she have been so naive? A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Her heart jumped in her chest. She wasn't ready to face him. Not now, not when her world was crumbling around her. But before she could retreat further, the door opened. Lucas stepped inside, his face drawn and tired. The moment he saw her, his expression softened, but there was something guarded in his eyes. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Carmen's mind raced. "Talk? About what? About your family's dirty secrets?" But she couldn't say that. Not yet. Instead, she crossed her arms, holding her composure as best as she could. "What's going on, Lucas?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but she couldn't stop the sharp edge in her tone. "I think you know," he replied, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. He closed the door behind him and took a step closer. "Carmen, I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but there's something I need to tell you." Carmen's pulse quickened, and she fought the urge to back away. She had already read the article. She already knew what he was going to say, but she had to hear it from him. Lucas stopped, rubbing a hand over his face as though struggling to find the right words. "My father's business, the company, everything, it's not what you think. I've been trying to distance myself from him for years, but..." He trailed off, and Carmen felt a strange mixture of anger and betrayal surge through her. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice even. "But you haven't. You're still tied to it. To him." Lucas winced, the weight of her words hitting him. "I'm not proud of what he did. I've tried to make my own way, but the legacy is mine too, and I can't just erase it." Carmen stood there, the hurt flooding through her. She had trusted him, had believed in him when everyone else would have dismissed him as just another rich man playing games. But now, everything she had built in her mind about Lucas, everything they had shared, felt hollow. "I don't know what you want me to say," Lucas said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "I never wanted to bring you into this, but it's been haunting me, and I don't want to hide it from you anymore." Carmen took a step back, her heart heavy. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore." Lucas reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, but he didn't touch her. His eyes were full of regret, but there was nothing he could say to undo the damage, and in that moment, Carmen realized that nothing would ever be the same again. Carmen sat in the quiet of her apartment, the soft hum of the city outside doing little to drown the thoughts swirling inside her head. She had spent hours replaying the conversation with Lucas, trying to make sense of it all. His confession, his hesitation, his regret. It all felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She had always known that Lucas came from a world of privilege. She had never been naive enough to think that his past was entirely clean, but she had trusted him, trusted that he wasn't like the others. But now, it seemed that everything she had believed about him was crumbling. The image she had built of Lucas, the man she had come to care for, was shattered. His father's corruption, his complicity, all of it hung in the air between them like an unspoken truth. Carmen's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She didn't even need to look at the screen to know who it was. Lucas. She had told herself she wouldn't pick up. She had told herself that she needed space, needed time to figure out what she truly felt. But when the phone buzzed again, the urge to hear his voice was too strong to resist. With a deep breath, she answered. "Carmen." Lucas's voice came through the speaker, strained and anxious. "I know things are complicated right now, but I need you to understand something." Her heart pounded in her chest, the words she had rehearsed in her mind ready to come out. "Why should I trust you now, Lucas?" But instead of responding with anger, her voice was quiet, almost resigned. "What is it, Lucas? What do you need me to understand?" He exhaled sharply, the sound of him pacing on the other end of the line faintly audible. "I made mistakes. I didn't want you to know about my past, about my family's business. I should have told you. I should have been honest with you from the start, but Why didn't you?" Carmen cut in, her voice rising. "Why keep it a secret? All this time, you've kept things from me, and now I'm supposed to just forget it?" There was a long pause, and for a moment, Carmen wasn't sure if he had hung up. But then his voice returned, softer, more vulnerable than before. "Because I was scared," Lucas admitted. "I was scared you'd think I was just like him. I was scared that if you knew the truth, you'd leave. And the last thing I wanted was to lose you." Carmen's chest tightened at his words, and for the first time since that conversation, she let herself feel the weight of it all. There had been so many moments when she had thought about walking away, when she had questioned whether Lucas was worth the heartache. But hearing him say that, hearing the rawness in his voice, made something shift inside her. "I don't know what to think anymore, Lucas," Carmen said, the words coming out in a fragile whisper. "I don't know if I can just ignore everything you've been hiding." Lucas's voice cracked slightly as he responded. "I don't want you to ignore it. I want you to see who I really am. The man who's been trying to do the right thing, despite my family. I want to prove to you that I'm not my father. I'm not the man who built his fortune on lies." Carmen closed her eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. She had trusted him once, against her better judgment, and she wanted to believe that he wasn't just like the people she had spent her whole life trying to escape. But trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. She wasn't sure if she was ready to take that leap again. "Lucas, I need time," she said finally, her voice steady, though her heart was in turmoil. "I need to figure out if this is something I can move past. If you're really the person you say you are, then I'll try. But it's not going to be easy." There was silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Carmen thought he might say something else, something that could change everything. But instead, all she heard was a deep breath. "I understand," he replied, his voice quiet. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." With those words, the line went silent, and Carmen felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty wash over her. She didn't have the answers. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in days, she felt a small spark of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the beginning of something new, something that could work, if they were both willing to fight for it. As the night stretched on, Carmen sat by her window, looking out at the city lights. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely lost. The morning after her conversation with Lucas, Carmen sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of her. The weight of the conversation had not lightened with time. She had asked for space, for time to think. And yet, as the day stretched on, she found herself feeling more uncertain than ever. She could still hear Lucas's voice, the sincerity in his words cutting through the chaos in her mind. He wanted to prove he wasn't his father. He wanted to show her that he wasn't like the man who had built his fortune off lies and manipulation. But did she believe him? Could she trust him again, knowing the history that followed him like a shadow? The phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Tommy. "How's it going?" Carmen stared at the screen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't sure how to explain everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. The betrayal she felt, the doubt, the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something real between her and Lucas. "I'm figuring it out," she typed back, keeping it vague. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. There was something bigger at stake now. It wasn't just about Lucas or their relationship. It was about her. It was about her dignity. Her stall at the market had always been a symbol of her independence. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. And now, that was at risk. The city council had passed new regulations that would directly affect her business, threatening to shut her down unless she complied with an expensive and complicated series of new rules. Carmen wasn't about to let that happen. With a deep breath, she grabbed her phone and dialed the number of her lawyer, willing herself to sound confident despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. The voice on the other end picked up quickly. "Miss Diaz, what can I help you with?" "I need you to help me fight back," Carmen said, her voice firm. "I'm not going to let them take my stall away. I've worked too hard for this." Her lawyer was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "You know this won't be easy, right? They have the law on their side." Carmen gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white. "I don't care about their rules. I care about what's right. I've been fighting to keep this business running, and I'm not going to let them close it down because of some loophole." The lawyer sighed again, but there was a sense of approval in his voice when he spoke. "All right, I'll gather the paperwork, but you need to prepare yourself. This will take time and it's going to get ugly." Carmen hung up the phone and set it down with a sense of determination. The fight for her dignity had just begun. This wasn't just about fighting the system. It was about showing everyone that people like her mattered. She wasn't going to be pushed aside, not now and not ever. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Lucas standing in the doorway, his face drawn, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. He hadn't texted or called her in hours. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or angry to see him standing there. "Carmen," he said quietly, almost hesitantly, as though he wasn't sure how to begin. "What do you want, Lucas?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. She wasn't in the mood for another round of empty apologies. "I want to help," he said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "I know things have been difficult, but I've been thinking about what you said. I want to make it right. I know I can't erase the past, but I can stand by you now." Carmen crossed her arms, her stance defensive. "You want to make it right?" she repeated. "By doing what? Fixing your father's mess, or by playing the hero who swoops in to save the day?" "I'm not playing the hero," Lucas said, his tone firm now. "I'm saying that I'm here for you. If you want to fight back, I'll help you. I'll use my resources to make sure they don't get away with this." She felt a mix of emotions churn within her. Suspicion, relief, anger. It was all too much. Could she really accept his help? Could she trust that he wasn't just doing it to absolve himself of guilt? "Why now?" Carmen asked, her voice quieter, more vulnerable. "Why do you care so much? Is it because you want to make up for your father's sins? Or is it because you think I'm just some charity case you can fix?" Lucas took a step forward, his eyes locking onto hers with a raw intensity. "I care because I've seen what you've built, Carmen. I've seen your strength, and I want to be a part of that. Not just because of the guilt I feel, but because I respect you. I want to help, not because I owe it to you, but because I believe in what you're doing." For the first time in days, Carmen felt the wall she had built around herself start to crack. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something real between them. But it wasn't just about Lucas. It was about her fight for what she deserved. "You don't owe me anything, Lucas," she said, her voice steady now. "But if you really want to help, then prove it. Don't just stand there and talk about it. Show me that you mean it." He nodded, his expression determined. "I will. I'll do whatever it takes." And for the first time, Carmen believed him. The morning of the council meeting arrived with a heavy, still quiet. Carmen had spent the night pacing, her thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty and resolve. She hadn't let herself rest, not when so much was at stake. Today was the day she would fight for everything she had built, the market stall, the dignity, the future she had worked so hard to claim. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her jacket. The same jacket she had worn to the gala when she had walked into a room full of strangers who judged her at every turn. But today, it wasn't about them. Today was about her. Lucas had been by her side throughout the past few days. He had made calls, pulled strings, and arranged meetings with lawyers and city officials. It was the first time she had seen him work without the weight of his family's expectations hanging over him. He had been true to his word, standing by her, fighting for her, and it had made all the difference. But as she prepared to walk into the meeting, she still felt the old doubts creep in. Was she doing the right thing? Was this fight even winnable? The system was stacked against her, and the people who held the power had no interest in protecting a small fishmonger. "Are you ready?" Lucas's voice cut through the silence, gentle but unwavering. She turned to face him, the look in his eyes showing not a hint of doubt, only confidence in her. He was there, not as a knight on a white horse, but as someone who had come to understand her struggles and her strength. He wasn't just there to fix things. He was there because he believed in what she was fighting for. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do this." The drive to City Hall was quick, the streets passing by in a blur. Carmen's mind raced, her hands gripped tightly around the folder containing the evidence and arguments that would make her case. It wasn't just about the regulations. It was about the principle, about standing up against a system that had never cared about people like her. When they arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. The council chambers were filled with powerful figures, most of whom had already made up their minds about her business. But Carmen wasn't going to let their dismissive stares affect her. She had something they didn't. She had the truth, and she was ready to speak it. As the meeting began, Carmen stood tall, the weight of all those who had doubted her pushing her forward. She laid out her case with clarity, the words flowing from her with a conviction that surprised even herself. She didn't just argue against the new regulations. She painted a picture of what the city stood to lose if they took her stall away, if they took away the lifeblood of the small businesses that defined the community. Her voice shook with emotion as she spoke of the people who relied on her, the relationships she had built over the years, and the sense of pride she felt every time she came to work. She wasn't just a fishmonger. She was a part of something bigger, something worth protecting. As the room fell silent, she caught a glimpse of Lucas standing off to the side, his eyes locked on her. She could see the pride in his gaze, but more importantly, she could see that he was fully there with her, not just as a bystander, but as someone who truly understood why this was so important. The council members began to speak, their voices low but careful. There was hesitation in their words, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. And slowly, one by one, they began to question the very regulations they had pushed forward. The next few hours were a blur, but by the end of it all, Carmen had won. The regulations were suspended and her stall was saved. It wasn't just a victory for her business. It was a victory for every small person, every working-class individual who had ever been dismissed by the powerful. She stepped out of the council chambers, the weight that had been pressing down on her for so long lifting. She had done it. She had fought, and she had won. Not because she had Lucas's help, but because she had stood up for herself, for what she believed in. As they walked out into the cool air, Carmen turned to Lucas. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Lucas smiled, but there was no arrogance in it. "You could have," he said. "You were always capable. I just helped you see it." Carmen smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. The fight wasn't over, but this was the first step towards something bigger. She had reclaimed her dignity, and for the first time in a long time, she believed she truly belonged.